Red Butte wasn't the kind of town where whispers stayed small. They traveled faster than dust devils and stuck twice as long. On a late spring afternoon, when the sun baked the wooden boardwalks and the horizon shimmered like a fever dream, Clara Dawson stepped out of the schoolhouse and unknowingly walked straight into the moment that would change everything. She saw trouble before she heard it. A group of miners stood in the middle of Main Street, circling a tall Apache scout named Taza, who worked with the cavalry as a translator and trail guide. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just leading a tired horse to the well, but the miners were already red-faced, cursing, and puffed up with the kind of boldness that comes from boredom and cheap whiskey. Clara's heart thudded painfully. Taza stood calm and still, but the tension around him was as sharp as barbed wire. Red Butte was a place where one glared spark could light a wildfire, and every person watching knew it. "Go on back to the fort," one miner barked, stepping too close. "We don't want your kind walking our streets like you own them." Taza didn't move. His voice was even, carefully measured. "I am only giving my horse water." But to the miners already eager for trouble, his calm sounded like challenge. Clara glanced around. Townsfolk stood watching but didn't step forward. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed curious. A few, she realized with a cold twist in her stomach, were waiting for something ugly to happen. She didn't know Taza well, not really. But she'd seen him teach children how to read animal tracks near the riverbank. And she'd seen him return a lost calf to the Sanchez family when no one else could find it. He wasn't a threat. He was patient, quiet, and fair. More so, Clara thought bitterly, than many men who wore badges or carried guns. When the miner reached for Taza's reins, Clara's feet moved before her thoughts caught up. She hurried across the street, skirts swishing through dust, and slipped between them. "Stop," she said, breathless but loud enough to catch every ear. "Leave him alone." The words stunned everyone, including herself. The miners blinked in disbelief. And Taza. He simply looked at her, steady and unreadable, though something warm flickered in his dark eyes. Clara swallowed hard. This wasn't a moment a proper schoolteacher was supposed to step into. A woman wasn't supposed to interfere with angry men. And no woman in Red Butte dared publicly defend an Apache scout. She felt the weight of every unspoken rule pressing on her. She leaned closer to Taza, her voice barely a whisper. "Such things are forbidden." She meant the whole situation, her interference, her speaking to him this way, the town's judgment. Everything. But Taza heard more than her words. He heard her fear, her courage, and her conflict. Instead of reacting with anger or pride, he nodded once slowly, respectfully, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Then he lifted his reins and stepped back from the miners. "I will come later," he said simply. The miners hesitated. They weren't brave enough to start a fight in front of the schoolteacher. With grumbles and curses, they drifted away, losing interest now that the crowd wasn't hungry for violence. The quiet that followed was thick. Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, more from the shock of what she'd just done. Taza studied her carefully. "You should not have risked yourself for me," he said softly. "I shouldn't have had to," she replied before she could stop herself. He held her gaze for a long moment. Not with gratitude, though she sensed that too, but with a kind of deep, thoughtful recognition. As if she had revealed something more important than she intended. She felt her cheeks flush. "People will talk," she added, glancing around at the onlookers, pretending not to stare. "People always talk," Taza said, tying his horse to a hitching post. "But truth is not changed by whispers." Clara didn't know how to answer that. She only knew the miners would twist this encounter into rumors by supper time. Yet as she watched Taza lead his tired horse toward the well, she also knew this, for reasons she couldn't name. She did not regret what she'd done, not one bit, because sometimes she realized the things people call forbidden are simply things they do not yet understand. The next few days drifted by like wind over tall grass, quiet on the surface, restless underneath. Red Butte buzzed with the usual business of ranch work, freight wagons, and saloon clamor, but Clara felt the shift in people's glances when she walked by. Some were curious. A few were suspicious. And at least one miner spat near her boots when he passed. She didn't regret standing up to them. But she knew the town wouldn't forget it any time soon. By Friday afternoon, Clara needed fresh air and a break from arithmetic lessons and ink-stained fingers. She dismissed her students early and wandered down the trail that wound behind the schoolhouse toward the riverbank. The cottonwood trees there were tall and old, their leaves whispering like soft-spoken storytellers. Clara loved the place. It was the only spot in town where the noise of judgment didn't reach her. But today, she wasn't alone. As she approached the clearing, she heard laughter, bright, cheerful, carefree. When she stepped through the branches, she saw Taza kneeling in the dirt with 3 local children clustered around him. Little Annie Metzler was leaning forward eagerly, her blonde hair a tangle of sunlight. "Do it again," she begged. Tazia smiled. Not a big smile. He wasn't the showy kind, but a gentle one that warmed his whole face. He pressed his palm into the dirt and slowly lifted it. A perfect imprint remained, every line and shape clear. "Tracks tell stories," he explained. "The land remembers everything that moves through it." Annie squealed with delight. Tommy Lee and Miguel Sanchez leaned forward in awe. Clara had never seen Taza like this, still steady, still reserved, but open, patient, and quietly joyful. She lingered in the shadows, watching him show the children how to read signs of animals, broken twigs, disturbed stones, soft prints leading toward the river. He pointed toward distant hills. A rabbit runs in curves, so its scent is confusing. A deer runs straight. A coyote moves with purpose, always thinking. To understand the land, you must understand behavior. The children nodded as if he were some wise figure out of an adventure story. Clara stepped into the clearing at last. "I hope I'm not interrupting." 3 heads whipped toward her with excited greetings. Taza, however, rose slowly and respectfully, brushing dirt from his hands. She noticed him doing that, always careful not to appear imposing, even when he'd done nothing wrong. "You are not interrupting," he said. "They asked me to show them how to read tracks." Clara gave the children a warm smile. "It looks like you're learning faster than I ever could." "Oh, Miss Dawson." Annie ran to her. "Did you know foxes step in their own footprints to stay quiet?" "I did not," Clara admitted. "Thank you for teaching me." Taza nodded toward the cottonwoods. "This place is good for learning. The river watches but does not judge." Clara wasn't sure if he meant it symbolically, but the words struck her anyway. She moved closer, kneeling beside the tracks they'd made. "I didn't realize you taught children. I'm impressed." "It is not teaching," he said simply. "It is sharing what should not be forgotten." His voice held a weight she wanted to understand. Clara knew most settlers were taught that Apache ways were savage or primitive, dangerous lies passed from adult to primitive, childlike bad heirlooms. Yet here was evidence to the contrary. A man teaching children how to understand the world around them with patience and kindness. "I wish the town could see this," Clara murmured. "They would not look," Taza replied quietly. "Not yet." She looked at him, then really looked. His face was calm, but there was a lifetime of experience behind his eyes. He'd weathered prejudice the way trees weather storms, with quiet strength. The children begged him for another lesson, but Clara gently dismissed them so they could help their families with chores. When they raced off, Taza and Clara stood alone beneath the rustling cottonwoods. "You are different from most in Red Butte," Taza said. "You wish to learn, not to fear." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I wasn't raised to understand much about your people," she confessed. "But I can see how unfair the stories are." Taza studied her, thoughtful. "Understanding begins when someone chooses to look past fear." His words settled in her chest like a new truth. Then he added, softly but clearly, "You chose to look." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition, genuine, honest, and unexpectedly powerful. And for the first time since the confrontation with the miners, Clara felt something new, not fear, not regret. Red Butte was a small town where news traveled faster than a stagecoach, and rumors had a way of growing taller than the mesas themselves. By the following week, Clara noticed that whispers about her and Taza had shifted into something sharper, something more dangerous. The town wasn't just curious anymore, it was restless. And suspicion lingered like a dust storm that refused to settle. It began when the ranchers noticed that several horses had gone missing from the outskirts of Red Butte. Some were old, some young, but all were prized, and the owners were furious. It wasn't long before accusations began to fly. And unsurprisingly, all eyes landed on Taza, the Apache scout who had already caused a stir simply by existing in their town. "You see them tracks?" growled one of the ranchers, pointing to faint hoof prints near the river. "That's him, I swear. Probably planning his next ride before the night falls." Clara had been walking along the riverbank with a small basket of school supplies for her students when she overheard the conversation. She felt her stomach tighten. She knew without a doubt that Taza hadn't stolen a single horse. The tracks were misleading, the horses' paths intentionally confused by the real thieves. She had even spotted a suspicious pair near the Western Canyon the day before. She followed the murmurs back to town, hoping to intervene before the tension escalated. But as she neared the sheriff's office, she saw Taza standing outside, calm as ever, tying his horse to the hitching post. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were watchful, scanning the street. A few townsfolk were whispering behind their hands, throwing him suspicious glances. Some muttered harsh comments under their breath, but no one dared speak directly to him. "Miss Dawson." Taza greeted her quietly, giving her a nod of acknowledgement. There was no relief in his voice, only a controlled patience. The kind of patience he had shown with the children under the cottonwoods. "They're accusing you," Clara said softly, glancing around to see the townspeople's reactions, "of stealing horses. But I saw the real thieves near the canyon yesterday." Taza shook his head slightly. "Accusations are easy. Proof is hard. Let the truth reveal itself." Clara bit her lip. His calm, deliberate words made her both admire him and grow anxious. She knew how quickly anger could turn into violence in Red Butte, and how dangerous rumors could become when fueled by pride and fear. "You shouldn't let them push you around," she whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I do not answer anger with anger," Taza replied. His voice was steady, almost serene. "That is how misunderstandings grow into conflict. The land teaches patience. So does justice." Clara nodded, but she could feel the tension in the air like static electricity before a storm. She glanced toward the sheriff, who seemed torn between enforcing the law and appeasing the ranchers. "We have to find a way to prove it," she said, "before someone gets hurt or worse, before they decide to take matters into their own hands." Taza's eyes softened slightly as he studied her. "You wish to act," he said, "but you must act with careful thought. Fear rules men faster than horses." Clara felt a shiver of admiration and worry. Taza wasn't just calm. He was wise beyond what she had imagined. And yet, her heart ached knowing the town might never see his character for themselves. The moment any horse went missing, the old prejudices came roaring back. That evening, Clara returned home, thinking over every step they could take to uncover the truth. She pored over maps of the nearby canyon and river trails, recalling what she had seen the day before. She realized that her own knowledge of the land, her experience walking the trails, observing nature, and teaching children was just as valuable as Taza's together. They had a chance to prove what was right, even if the town was not ready to understand as night fell. The wind whispered through the streets of Red Butte. Somewhere beyond the hills, the real horse thieves were already planning their next move, oblivious to the pair who were determined to stop them. And Clara knew that what was forbidden yesterday, standing beside Taza, defending him, would soon become necessary. For now, the town's suspicion simmered. But with patience, courage, and careful planning, Clara and Taza were about to turn the tide. The morning sun cut sharp lines across Red Butte's boardwalks, casting long shadows that seemed to follow Clara wherever she went. In the few days since the accusations against Taza had begun, whispers had grown into murmurs, murmurs into pointed stares, and stares into murmured threats. By now, the town was watching, waiting, wondering what she would do. And Clara knew the choice before her was forbidden, at least. Forbidden by the rules she had been raised to follow. School was over, and Clara lingered in the doorway of her little classroom, listening to the echo of children's laughter as they ran home. She felt the weight of every gaze in town, every skeptical eye, every whisper of gossip that had followed her since she defended Taza. She knew that if she spoke up now, she would be stepping beyond the bounds of what society expected of a woman, quiet, obedient, and invisible. But she also knew that truth demanded courage. The town meeting that morning was held in the small, wooden hall near the general store. Ranchers, miners, and townsfolk crowded into the room, voices buzzing with accusations. The sheriff, a graying man who had once been a soldier, sat behind a tall desk, trying to maintain order. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on, and Clara's stomach twisted with every muttered word. Taza stood at the edge of the room, calm as ever, hands clasped behind his back. His presence alone was enough to draw suspicion and resentment. Clara swallowed hard, feeling the fear rise in her chest, the same fear she had felt the first time she warned him on the dusty street. But this time, fear was no longer a reason to remain silent. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as she walked to the center of the hall. All eyes turned toward her, and for a heartbeat, the room held its breath. "I have something to say," Clara began, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "Taza has not stolen any horses. I saw the real thieves near the Western Canyon. I know what I saw." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few ranchers scowled, their faces red with anger. Some townsfolk whispered nervously to each other. Clara ignored them, keeping her gaze on Taza, who nodded slightly, acknowledging her courage. "You should not speak for him," one miner growled. "This is no place for a woman to challenge us." Clara's jaw tightened. Forbidden, she thought, remembering all the warnings she had been given since girlhood. A woman's place was silent, obedient, invisible. But standing here, seeing the calm resolve in Taza's eyes, she realized that courage wasn't about defying rules, it was about defending what was right. "I will speak," she said, her voice now steady, "because truth matters more than fear, and because no one should be judged before the facts are known." The room grew silent. Even the sheriff looked up from his desk, his eyebrows raised. Clara felt a surge of strength, like the river behind the cottonwoods that had always reminded her of patience and persistence. She knew her words might draw criticism, perhaps even danger, but she also knew that doing nothing was worse. Taza finally stepped forward, not to speak for himself, but to stand beside her. His presence was a quiet reassurance, a statement that they were united in seeking justice. Not confrontation, "You chose to speak," he said quietly. Just for her, his voice carrying across the hush of the hall. "And that choice matters." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had stepped beyond the boundaries of what was forbidden, and yet, in doing so, she had discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed. The rest of the morning passed in tense deliberation. With Clara's testimony and careful questioning by the sheriff, the trail of the real thieves began to take shape. By the time the meeting adjourned, the town's suspicion had not vanished, but for the first time, reason and truth had a chance to guide them. Rather than prejudice and rumor dot as Clara stepped outside into the bright sunlight, she felt the weight of the town's gaze lessen slightly. For all its whispers, Red Butte had seen her choice, and in that act, something had shifted. She glanced at Taza, whose steady presence reminded her that courage and understanding could bridge the widest divides. And in that moment, she knew that forbidden things weren't always wrong, they were often simply untried, waiting for someone brave enough to try them. The day was blazing hot, and the sun poured down over Red Butte's mesas like molten gold. Clara stood at the edge of the canyon, scanning the rocky ridges for any sign of movement. The townsfolk had done their best to trace the stolen horses, but it had become clear that the real thieves were clever, leaving confusing tracks to mislead anyone following them. Taza arrived quietly, his horse moving like a shadow beside him. He had been tracking the trail since dawn, his eyes sharp, reading the landscape as if it spoke to him in whispers only he could understand. Clara's heart pounded not just from the heat or the climb ahead, but from the knowledge that danger was real and that she was stepping into it willingly. "We need to follow the horse's true path," Taza said calmly, dismounting and checking the tracks in the dirt. His hands moved with practiced precision, brushing away sand, examining the hoof prints. "The thieves intended to mislead us. They do not know the land like we do." Clara nodded, swallowing her fear. "I saw them near the canyon yesterday. They tried to confuse their trail by crossing the river twice. I think we can catch up if we move quickly." Together, they mounted their horses, moving down the canyon's winding paths. The landscape was harsh and jagged, but Taza navigated it with confidence, his knowledge of the land far surpassing any map Clara had ever seen. She tried to keep pace, holding tight to the reins as her horse navigated steep slopes and loose stones. The silence between them was not awkward, it was focused, filled with the rhythm of hooves on rock and the occasional call of a distant hawk. Yet when Clara finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly with nerves. "Taza, what if they're armed? What if they are frightened of exposure?" he interrupted gently. "They are not skilled fighters. They rely on confusion and fear. Courage and knowledge are our allies." Clara considered this and realized he was right. His calmness steadied her. She had spent her life teaching children, guiding them with patience, and now she was learning that same lesson applied to life. Careful observation and understanding could solve far more than anger or brute force. Hours passed as they tracked the thieves deeper into the canyon. Every ridge they rounded, every hidden ravine they crossed, brought them closer. Clara felt the thrill of the chase and the danger mingling in her chest. And yet, she noticed something else. The thrill was tempered by a growing respect and trust for Taza. He had faced danger before, and his quiet confidence gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed. Finally, near a bend where the canyon walls narrowed sharply, they spotted movement. The thieves were attempting to corral the horses into a shallow ravine, thinking it would hide them from pursuers. Taza nudged his horse forward, keeping low to avoid detection. Clara followed, her pulse racing. "On my mark," Taza whispered, examining the position of the thieves. "We cannot charge recklessly. We must guide the horses without causing panic." Clara understood instantly. Her mind, trained in careful planning and observation, could complement Taza's skill in tracking and reading animal behavior. She felt a thrill of partnership, two very different people working as one to correct a wrong. They approached quietly, and with a series of gentle gestures and calls, Taza guided the horses toward a safe path away from the ravine. Clara followed his instructions, her hands steady despite the fear in her chest. One of the thieves noticed them too late, shouting in frustration. But the two of them were already beyond reach by the time the sheriff and a few townsfolk arrived, summoned by Clara earlier via a rider. The horses were safe, and the thieves were cornered. The town's anger had nowhere to go but truth. Clara breathed deeply, letting the canyon's dry wind fill her lungs. She glanced at Taza, who simply nodded in acknowledgement. "You were brave," he said softly. "And careful. That is how challenges are met." Clara felt warmth rise in her chest. She had risked much today, and yet she knew the reward was not just justice, it was understanding, respect, and the knowledge that courage could be measured in wisdom as much as in action. For the first time, she realized that fear could be transformed into something positive when paired with thought, observation, and a partner who understood the land, the challenge, and the heart. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mesas, turning the sky into a fiery canvas of orange and gold. When Clara and Taza led the horses safely back toward Red Butte, the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dust, mingling with the tension that had been hanging over the town for days. By now, word had spread that the stolen horses had been found and that the real thieves had been caught, but people in Red Butte were slow to change their minds. Suspicion had roots that ran deep. The sheriff, a sturdy man with graying hair and a careful eye, greeted them as they reached the town square. He looked first at the horses, all accounted for, then at Clara and Taza, standing side by side, still on horseback. His expression softened. "You did good work," he said gruffly, tipping his hat. "These horses are yours, all of them. And I reckon we can hold these two thieves accountable now." The thieves, a pair of lanky men with a kind of cocky bravado that comes from years of evading responsibility, were being led toward the small jail. Their faces were pale, their earlier arrogance replaced with worry. They had miscalculated. They had underestimated the land, the trackers, and most importantly, the courage of those who knew truth when they saw it. Taza dismounted first, his movements calm and deliberate, and gave the horses a gentle pat. Clara followed, her heart still pounding from the day's chase. She knew this moment would be remembered not just for the recovery of the horses, but for what it represented: justice founded on evidence, patience, and understanding rather than fear and prejudice. The townsfolk had gathered in the square, murmuring among themselves. At first, the whispers were wary, skeptical. Some frowned, muttering that perhaps an Apache scout shouldn't have been trusted in the first place. But as they saw the horses safe and the real thieves in custody, their frowns began to falter. Some nodded quietly to themselves, realizing that maybe their assumptions had been wrong. Clara stepped forward, brushing her skirts, and spoke clearly to the crowd. The horses were taken, yes, but Taza did not steal them. He helped us find them, and he did so with care, knowledge, and honesty. We should judge people by their actions, not by old fears or rumors. A few heads turned, some faces softened, and the murmurs quieted. It wasn't immediate acceptance, but it was a start. Small steps toward understanding. The sheriff raised his hand. "Miss Dawson is right. These men will answer for their actions. And anyone else who doubts the truth should take note. The world doesn't work by fear and prejudice. It works by honesty, courage, and knowing the land you walk upon." Clara's chest swelled with quiet pride. She had acted when it was forbidden, defended truth when the town wanted easy assumptions, and helped guide justice, not with violence, but with knowledge, patience, and partnership. Taza finally spoke, addressing the crowd in his steady, calm voice. Truth is not a matter of who you are. It is a matter of what you do. His words, simple yet profound, hung in the warm evening air. Even the most skeptical townsfolk had to pause and consider as the horses were returned to their owners. The gratitude was tentative at first. Some gave nods of acknowledgement, others murmured apologies, and a few even offered a small word of thanks directly to Taza. Clara noticed the subtle shift. Suspicion was fading, replaced by respect. Slowly, the town was learning that understanding and cooperation could bridge old divides. Once the last horse had been claimed, Clara and Taza walked together toward the schoolhouse. The wind rustled the sagebrush, carrying with it a quiet sense of completion. The danger was over. The town's judgment had begun to soften. And most importantly, the lesson had been made clear. Courage and knowledge often speak louder than prejudice. Clara turned to Taza, smiling. "We did it," she said softly. Taza nodded, eyes warm. "We did. And Red Butte will remember, in its own way, what truth looks like." For the first time in days, Clara felt a deep, unshakable relief. The town had witnessed justice. The horses were safe. And fear had been replaced with understanding, however small and cautious. It was a start. And in the quiet of the sunset-lit plains, Clara realized that sometimes the right choice, no matter how forbidden it seemed, could change everything. The weeks that followed the recovery of the horses brought a quiet transformation to Red Butte. The town remained rugged and slow to change, but the air no longer carried the same sharp edge of suspicion. People still whispered, yes, but now there was curiosity, a subtle shift toward listening rather than judging. And at the center of this slow awakening were Clara Dawson and Taza, whose partnership had become a living example of how understanding and courage could reshape minds. Clara had returned to her schoolhouse, but her lessons were no longer only about reading, writing, and arithmetic. She had begun incorporating lessons about the land, the seasons, and the history of the peoples who had lived on it long before Red Butte existed. She taught children how to read tracks, how to respect nature, and how to approach differences with curiosity rather than fear. The Apache methods she learned from Taza became part of her classroom practical. Engaging and full of respect for the natural world. At first, some parents were skeptical. They whispered among themselves that a school teacher should not teach foreign ways to their children. But the children thrived. They came home excited, eager to show their families what they had learned about the land, the animals, and the people who had lived there long before any of the settlers arrived. Slowly, even the skeptical parents began to see the value in what Clara and Taza were sharing. Knowledge had a way of softening hardened hearts. Taza, meanwhile, became a familiar figure in town. He walked through Red Butte with the same calm presence, guiding children in tracking, explaining nature, and quietly demonstrating respect and patience in all interactions. He didn't demand acceptance or friendship. He simply lived in a way that could not be ignored. Those who watched him closely, first out of suspicion, began to understand that his wisdom was real, and his character unshakable. Clara often met him beneath the cottonwoods, their favorite spot by the river. The children would gather there sometimes, their laughter mixing with the whisper of leaves, but often it was just the two of them, sharing thoughts about the land, the town, and the lessons that had been learned. "You've changed things here," Clara said one afternoon, watching Taza point out the subtle tracks of a deer making its way along the riverbank. "The town is different. People are listening more." Taza's eyes softened, following the deer's path before meeting hers. "Change comes slowly," he said, "but children can carry it faster than adults. They learn without the weight of fear or prejudice." And they teach what they learn. Clara smiled, realizing the depth of truth in his words. I never thought that standing up for you would lead to this, she admitted. I thought I was just defending what was right. But it's more than that. We've started something bigger than ourselves. He nodded, the quiet confidence in his expression steady and reassuring. Yes, understanding begins small, grows in small ways, but it can outlast generations. The town may not change overnight, but the seeds are planted. Their partnership had become a bridge, not just between two people, but between two worlds that had long been divided by fear, ignorance, and stubborn tradition. Clara's lessons combined with Taza's knowledge offered the children and the town a chance to learn about cooperation, respect, and empathy. One evening, after a long day of lessons and exploration, Clara and Taza sat on a large boulder overlooking the river. The sky blazed with the colors of sunset, and the water reflected the fiery streaks like molten glass. Clara turned to him, her heart full. Maybe what was forbidden before isn't forbidden anymore, she said softly. Taza looked at her and smiled a rare, genuine expression that carried warmth and quiet joy. Understanding changes everything, he replied simply. Clara nodded, feeling the truth of that statement deep in her chest. The town would continue to face challenges, but now there was a path forward. One built on respect, knowledge, and courage, the very things that had brought them together. And as they sat together, watching the river flow endlessly toward the horizon, Clara realized that the most important lesson was not only for the children or the town. It was for herself, that fear and prejudice could be overcome, that patience and wisdom could triumph over ignorance, and that hearts willing to understand could change the world around them. One person at a time, the plains beyond Red Butte stretched endlessly, gold and green under a wide western sky that seemed to promise freedom, possibility, and new beginnings. Clara Dawson and Taza rode side by side along the soft trail, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust that glittered in the late afternoon sun. The town behind them was quieter now, but not silent. Its people were learning to look past fear and prejudice, step by step, guided by the lessons Clara and Taza had shared. Clara felt a deep sense of peace. She had come a long way from the frightened schoolteacher who had first whispered, "Such things are forbidden," on that dusty street. Back then, she had worried about speaking out, about defying the expectations of her town, and about standing beside an Apache man when everyone else thought it improper. But those fears had given way to courage, and courage had opened a door she hadn't even known existed. Taza glanced at her, his dark eyes reflecting the fading sun. "The town is learning," he said quietly. "Slowly, but it is learning." Clara smiled. "And it's because of you, Taza. You taught more than me. You taught the children, the town, everyone willing to see." He shook his head, modest but firm. "No, we taught together. You had the courage to stand for truth when it was forbidden. That is what opened hearts. Knowledge alone does not change people. Courage does." Clara's heart warmed at his words. She had always believed that teaching could change minds, but she realized now that action and example were equally important. It wasn't just the lessons she had taught in the schoolhouse or under the cottonwoods. It was standing up, refusing to stay silent, and demonstrating respect and understanding alongside Taza that had made the difference. They reached a gentle rise overlooking the valley. The wind rustled through the tall grasses, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of the river. Clara leaned over and gently touched Taza's arm. "I never imagined that what felt so forbidden could lead to something so right." Taza's lips curved in a small, quiet smile. "Understanding changes everything," he repeated. The same words that had come to define their journey. Clara laughed softly. "Maybe that should be our lesson to the town truth. Courage and patience." They rode down into the valley. and Clara noticed how the children from the schoolhouse were already running along the trails, eager to share what they had learned with one another. Some had followed the stories of Taza's tracking lessons, while others recounted the lessons about the land and its creatures. The joy and excitement in their eyes reminded Clara why teaching and standing for what was right mattered. Taza slowed his horse and nudged hers gently. "You see," he said, "the seeds we plant grow faster than expected when we nurture them. The town may still have work to do, but these children will carry what they learn far beyond Red Butte." Clara felt a swell of pride and hope. She realized that the real lesson extended beyond the canyon, the stolen horses, or the judgmental eyes of townsfolk. It was about fostering understanding, respect, and courage in the next generation, giving them tools to see people and the world clearly, without fear or prejudice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the plains in soft gold and purple hues, Taza turned to Clara. "Shall we return?" he asked gently. Clara looked back toward the town, now quiet in the distance. She nodded. "Yes, but not just to return. To continue teaching together." They rode back slowly, side by side, their silhouettes stretching long across the plain. Clara felt a joy she had never known before, the joy of partnership, of justice served, and of a world slowly learning to be better. When they reached Red Butte, the town was quiet but alive with small signs of change, children practicing the lessons they had learned, townsfolk talking quietly about what they had witnessed, and even the most skeptical faces softened by acknowledgement of courage and truth. Clara turned to Taza one last time as the sky darkened into a canopy of stars. "Maybe what was forbidden once isn't forbidden anymore," she whispered. Taza smiled, eyes reflecting the starlight. "Now, understanding has changed everything." And in that moment, Clara realized the full truth. Courage, respect, and knowledge could overcome fear, prejudice, and old rules. Together, they had planted seeds that would grow for generations, teaching Red Butte, its children, and themselves that the world could be a better, fairer, and brighter place. The plains stretched endlessly before them, full of promise. And under that vast western sky, Clara and Taza began a new chapter of life together, fearless and full of hope.